Okay, well, let's begin. So, first, very good evening to everyone and welcome to another session of Renaissance Lives. Today is Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469, 1527. It's more or less the dates of Leonardo da Vinci if you're trying to replace him. He's born about 10 years later. Now, Machiavelli, most people know him as the author of The Prince, but he was also a poet, a dramatist, the author of one of the most important comedy of the 16th century, a satirist, a classical scholar, a historian, a political analyst, as well as a particularly sharp critic of Christianity. So, to explore the world of Machiavelli, I am joined by Robert D. Black, who is author of Machiavelli from Radical to Reactionary. You can see the table of content on the screen. Bob is Emeritus Professor of Renaissance History at the University of Leeds. He has extensively written on Renaissance humanism and education during his long and distinguished career. It is also a pleasure to welcome his interlocutor, Simon Ditchfield. Simon, who did an MPhil and PhD at the Warburg Institute a long time ago in the 1980s, is now and since professor of early modern history at the University of York. His interests all relate to perceptions and use of the past in the context of urban and religious culture, in particular focused on the Italian peninsula from 1300 to 1800. He's currently preparing two books, one on the Jesuit Danielo Bartoli, which is Discovering How to Describe the World, Bartoli and the Writing of Global History, and is also preparing Papacy and the People, the Making of Roman Catholicism as a World Religion, 1500-1700, for the Oxford History of the Christian Church. And from this angle, from being a historian of Christianity and of the Counter-Reformation, Simon will be the interlocutor of Bob and will ask the first question. So Simon, we're listening to you.
Thank you very much, François. Thank you also for the invitation. It's a great privilege to be talking to Robert Black about Machiavelli. There's no one else, I think, on this planet who knows as much as Bob. So, well, we'll cut to the chase. Really, the first question I'd like to ask is, why did you write this book? I ask this because your excellent biography came out with Routledge just under 10 years ago, and it's now been translated in a heavily revised form by Viella in Rome, which came out earlier this year. But here we have Machiavelli from Radical to Reactionary. Over to you, Bob.
Well, I wrote this. I took this book on for. First, I'd like to thank Reaction Books and the Warburg Institute and François for inviting me and staging this. This podcast. I wrote, my reason for writing this book was that I still felt that after the publication of the Routledge book in 2013, that there was amazingly no biography of Machiavelli that connected his life with his writings and his thought. And because the famous important biography of Machiavelli, which went to 7 editions, was by Roberto Ridolfi, but he deliberately excluded all analysis of any of Machiavelli's writings. He stuck all to personal details and to factual events. Similarly, there was the biography that many of us grew up with, John Hale's biography, published in 1960, but that also dealt almost entirely with Machiavelli's diplomacy and had almost nothing to do of any substance with his works. And then there was the third thing, that a very popular biography of Machiavelli appeared in Italy and in the United States by Maurizio Viroli, but this book was mainly limited to salacious tidbits about Machiavelli and his sex life. So I felt that this was important to try to make a book that does link Machiavelli's works with his life. The other reason I put this on, I endeavored to do this, is that I felt that recent historiography, the last maybe 40, 50 years even, has tended to try to normalize Machiavelli, try to make Machiavelli less important and less original. And so I thought this was an impossibility because Machiavelli has had an absolutely enduring influence since his works first started to be published shortly after his death. And he became an immediate bestseller and has preoccupied people all over the world, really, since this time in the shortly after his death. And so I felt that it was impossible that he could have been so normal and so much like everybody else. Why would he be read if he was just like every other political writer?
Thank you, Bob. Yeah. Sorry to talk over you there. I'm just wanting to clearly address, you say at one point early on, you say, in fact, Machiavelli is more than a cliche.
Oh.
And you say he was a Florentine, the contemporary of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. And this leads me to ask you whether Machiavelli has become a cliche precisely because people have viewed him out of his immediate context.
Yeah, I think that Machiavelli has become it has become a cliche because it's become a cliche for many people just as an advocate and champion of immorality or amorality in politics. But I think there's another aspect. It's not just his immediate context that Machiavelli is not viewed in, but not viewed in a wider context. That he's not a cliche because political scientists, literary critics, philologists have all tended to look at Machiavelli as an abstraction, and instead there are then the people who try to normalize Machiavelli as neo-Ciceronian or neo-Aristotelian and so on. And therefore, I think that Machiavelli is out of context, a cliche, both because of the failure to see him in his immediate context, but also in a more general context.
Great. Well, that's in fact actually one other context that you bring to bear. And here in front of us, we've got the picture of the Machiavelli family property just south of Florence. Because one of the contexts I think you reconstruct so carefully, and which I found most rewarding, is that of his family background, in particular his relationship with his father, Bernardo, who you describe as a person of talent, whom Fortuna did not treat well, first by having him born a bastard, and then compounding his misfortune and his choice of a wife, whose first husband, Niccolo Benizzi, had been involved in an anti-Medici conspiracy, an affair in the 1450s that also involved Bernardo's cousin, Girolamo Machiavelli. And he was forced by these events to keep a low profile and remain an outsider, often in his property. And Bernardo seems to have found solace in his reading of the Latin classics, and also in raising his son, Niccolo, as a most proficient stylist. Given what you later say about the importance of Machiavelli's identity as a humanist, I was wondering whether you'd like to say more about Machiavelli's home education.
Right. Well, first of all, as to be expected from Bernardo, who was an learned an erudite lawyer, although he never practiced law in Florence or anywhere else. But he was also an amateur humanist, had an amateur humanist interest. And therefore, Bernardo ensured that Niccolo was given a thorough grounding in Latin and in rhetoric. But he wasn't given this grounding in Greek. Niccolo Machiavelli did not know Greek. That's because Bernardo himself didn't know Greek. And so he never engaged a Greek teacher. There was Greek in the 15th century was still very much a minority interest, even among humanists. Bernardo gave him most Florentines had quite thorough training, preliminary training in business arithmetic and business study, known as the Abacus School. But Machiavelli had a very truncated education or training with the abacus. And then Machiavelli, but also interesting, is that Machiavelli was never given a commercial apprenticeship or entered into any kind of business or trade. And this is very untypical of Florence. Virtually everybody, all the substantial people, all were interested in business. There are very few rentiers or people who are not interested in business and commerce and industry. So, I mean, Machiavelli was not in this, it was not given this kind of background, but he almost certainly was sent and attended the lectures at the University of Florence, and his professor there was Marcello Virgilio Adriani, who actually introduced Machiavelli to important humanist authors. For example, as a result of his connection with Adriani, Machiavelli copied out Lucretius's poem, famous classical poem, on the nature of things. And he also, under the influence of Adriani, probably, he also copied parts of Terence's comedy, The Eunuchus, and also translated, made a first version translated of Terence's Andrea. So, and interestingly, Machiavelli shared marginalia made marginalia together with his father to a copy of Biondo Flavio's Decades, a very famous humanist work. It's describing history from antiquity up until quite modern times at that time. So he had his direction in humanism was certainly stimulated by his father Bernardo. What wasn't stimulated by his father Bernardo was his legal. Bernardo was a legal erudite, but Machiavelli had no particular interest or it didn't go in that direction at all. So
that's interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting, because you say another striking judgment you make early on in the book is that Machiavelli was not just a humanist, but one of the greatest humanists. Yeah. Yet you also concede a few lines further on that Machiavelli was definitely a rhetorician and hardly a philologist. Given the centrality of the skill of close reading to the humanist project and the subversive capacity of philology at the hands, or should we say at the quill, of Lorenzo Valla, where it becomes almost a philosophy of life, does not that make Machiavelli a somewhat unusual humanist?
No, I don't think so, because it has to be understood that there are two actually aspects of humanism, especially linked to its actually origins. On one hand, it was originated from grammar, which means Latin, and that was the kind of humanism that you're talking about that was practiced by Lorenzo Valla. But there was also rhetoric. Rhetoric was quite different and focused much more on persuasion and on literary style, and therefore Machiavelli was really in the rhetorical branch of humanism. There are many famous humanists and important humanists who had no particular expertise or interest in philology. For example, Salutati, Accolti, Leonardo Bruni, Flavio Biondo, Bartolomeo Scala, and so on. And as Pasquale Stopelli has said quite recently, quite correctly, one doesn't have to be a philological genius like Poliziano to qualify as a humanist. So in that sense, Machiavelli was a humanist in the rhetorical direction, and as such, Machiavelli wrote a Florentine history that is, in my opinion, much more engaging because of its expertise in rhetoric and style of rhetoric than any of the classical historians, either Greek or Roman. It's much more engaging, I think, Herodotus, Thucydides, Polybius, Livy Sallust. Machiavelli, it's an absolutely gripping, a gripping work, influenced by this classical rhetoric. And for example, Machiavelli makes so much out of what Livy says. Livy doesn't draw all the rhetorical and political lessons himself. For example, the whole issue of killing the sons of Brutus. Well, this is a famous episode from Livy. Livy makes nothing out of it, but it becomes a huge issue for Machiavelli. So he really read these authors from his own point of view and developed a rhetorical approach from them. But this is very much in the line of earlier humanists. They weren't all philologists.
Thank you very much. What we're seeing in front of us on the screen now are the details from the Machiavelli's autograph transcription of the passage from Lucretius de Rerum Natura, which was one of the most famous kind of pagan atomist treatises from the classical times, that is rediscovered in the 15th century. And so it's freshly rediscovered when Machiavelli, very soon before Machiavelli is born. And so it's a nice bridge to our next question, really, which is talking about returning to sort of what's become, I suppose, almost a cliche in itself, but I know that you're going to elaborate on this, which is the strong theme of Machiavelli's consistent indifference and hostility to Christianity. And this enables Machiavelli, as you say, to view the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, who dominates briefly Florence, mentioned Florence, and Machiavelli is able then to see and to, so in a sense, unmask Savonarola as a political animal rather than a Dominican friar who used the cloak of religion to exercise his power. In what other ways do you think that Machiavelli's instrumental and secular view of religion impacted on his understanding of human nature?
Well, I think that, first of all, one has to realize that Machiavelli completely eschewed the Christian doctrine of salvation, of divine salvation. Machiavelli, for Machiavelli, the only aspect of possibility of any kind of post-mortem or after death mortality is secular, and that it is from man's only possible immortality, according to Machiavelli, is his capacity for glory in history, the remembrance in history. And this leads to an absolutely fundamental aspect of Machiavelli that is not often well appreciated, that the object of all Machiavelli's political thought and even historical thought was focused on the idea of glory, but glory not in the terms of, as it was seen even in the antiquity by Cicero or by in the Christian sort of divine, in terms of divine recognition or obedience to the divine power, but rather glory in history through political achievement. And this is consistently the actual goal of Machiavelli. People often say that Machiavelli is talking about success in politics or all sorts of other things, but it's really the real goal of Machiavelli is glory, but in a secular sense, glory in history. And that leads Machiavelli, or is accompanied to the idea of Machiavelli as his view that in The Prince and the Discourses, that man is irredeemably wicked in a Christian sense. Machiavelli believes that, and that is his the fundamental consequence of his whole secular and point of view here. And he completely was alien and rejected the entire Christian message.
Okay, well, that's probably a good thing. In fact, I was going to ask a bit more about his letters and his poetry, but we'll come back to that. And I think perhaps now we should turn actually to The Prince, which of course is the work that everyone identifies par excellence with Machiavelli. to an autobiographically almost misleading degree that arguably has no precedent in all literature at the time. You make the fascinating observation, which quite caught me off guard, that the sources of the Prince are neither classical nor humanist. Could you elaborate on why you think this is significant?
Well, I think it's significant. First of all, I would like to say that the Prince has many predecessors, at least in a formal sense, with the mirror of Prince's literature, which started in antiquity, was a very dominant form in the Middle Ages and also in the earlier Renaissance. But the point is about Machiavelli and the classics is that in the Prince, Machiavelli does what I would call cherry picks the classics. He takes little bits and pieces that from his extensive reading and uses them for his developing argument. But what he doesn't do in the Prince is to have a systematic and deep comparison between the contemporary world and between Roman antiquity. In the Discourses, he has these long parallels, almost one discourse after the next, the difference between what the Romans did and what contemporaries do. This does not occur in the Prince. It only occurs in the Prince in chapter 3, but which is actually, I'm quite certain, was added after the whole book was completed in 1515. So, and all the other reason I would say that Machiavelli in the Prince is not really connected, or is not really writing as on the basis of a classical past, is that he rejected in the Prince both Cicero's moral philosophy, which was dominant in the Middle Ages and even antiquity and in the Renaissance, and he also rejected Plato's ideal state, which Machiavelli said never existed. This, of course, was said by other people as well. But so the only real, and another aspect of this is the fact that is the style of the Prince, that Machiavelli says in the preface, in the dedication to the Prince, that he wasn't going to write in a fulsome humanist style, but he's going to keep it very terse, and that's certainly true. The Prince is not written in a neo-Ciceronian version of Italian at all. It has what's been described as a telegraphic style.
That's interesting, because in fact, sorry, please.
Go on, sorry.
No, I was going to say, but I was also struck by the force of language, your language that you use in describing the tone, or to borrow a term from operatic term of Verdi's, the tinta or color of the Prince. At one point you refer to the stench of the Prince is overwhelming, and yet the terms tyrant and tyranny are absent from the text. How do you account for this? Well,
the idea of the wicked world is a direct consequence, and the world around him was totally evil and totally wicked. This comes as a fundamental idea in the Prince, and it derives from Machiavelli's view of man, that man is entirely bad, has no redeeming features, and therefore he creates a world which, as Machiavelli says, has a stench. And for Machiavelli, man only does good if he's compelled to do so by necessity, through law or force or whatever. And that's the only time man does good. And the reason that the word of tyranny and tyrannical and tyrant are not mentioned in the Prince is that it would have been insulting to the Medici, to his Medici dedicatees. I mean, calling them, referring to them and associating them as tyranny would have been an ultimate insult. But what he did do is he virtually coined the phrase new prince. Now, the word new prince doesn't really occur in antiquity, and hardly in any of the literature on mirror of princes literature. It hardly occurs at all. It's almost obscure. But what Machiavelli, when he uses the word new prince, is a euphemism for tyrant. And this becomes absolutely clear in the Discourses, where Machiavelli at several points actually substitutes the word for new prince and tyrant and uses them interchangeably and as equivalents. So when Machiavelli constantly referring to a new prince, he's actually using a euphemism for tyrant.
Thank you. Another detail over which, doubtless pressed for space by the format of the series, you are unable to linger, is that you say that Machiavelli's closest literary model for the prince was Giles of Rome's scholastic treatise on the government of rulers. Could you say a bit more about Giles and the different circumstances under which his work was written?
Well, Giles was an Augustinian friar and a bishop and a theologian, but his work on the government of rulers was the most widely read and copied medieval, or almost the most widely read and copied medieval text on in the Mirror of Prince's Literature. The only work that has more manuscript copies is the pseudo-Aristotelian Secretum Secretorum, but it's a very widely copied. Now, the importance of Giles of Rome here is that Machiavelli's association with this text comes from the scholastic format with which Machiavelli writes his text, because in The Prince, the actual chapters, there are 26 chapters in the they're all numbered at the beginning. Now, this was not a characteristic of the humanist treatises in the Mirror of Prince's Literature. For example, Platina, Patrizzi, Beroaldo, Pontano, none of these treatises has numbered chapters, but numbering points in a commentary or a treatise was very much characteristic of the scholastics. It's all over the commentary literature. And therefore, so Machiavelli this is a bridge between Machiavelli and the commentary literature of Giles of Rome. But otherwise, Giles of Rome was actually, his ideas were really the equivalent, no different really from the humanists' ideas of in Mirror of Princes. What links Machiavelli to Giles of Rome and shows that he almost certainly had Giles of Rome on his desk or knew it by heart or knew lots of it by heart was this numbering of the chapters.
Very interesting. That's really interesting. Lovely detail. Finally, on The Prince, I was wondering what you had to say about the undoubtedly facetious remark made that perhaps precisely because of the work's brilliance, it was the most famous failed job application in history, as it failed to get him in favor with the Medici.
Well, we seem to have missed this out, but as I would have said earlier, Machiavelli, the reason Machiavelli's was not adopted in 1515 or a year or two before by the Medici was he was too closely associated with Giuliano de' Medici. Giuliano de' Medici was the youngest brother actually of Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, who became Leo X in 1513. And there was a rift between Leo X and his brother Giuliano. Giuliano was the first one who was sent to Florence after the Medici retook power in September 1512. He was the one who was sent by and left in Florence to run the Medici regime by the then Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici. But they really fell out. They had a totally different approach. Giuliano was very much connected with the aristocratic, middle of the road policy that connected him with these aristocrats. He was very much associated, very much wanted to see a Florence restored to an aristocratic oligarchic government with Medici cooperation. Whereas Leo X thought this was no good. He wanted a much more radical approach. So that Machiavelli's connection with Giuliano, in which actually went back to his Giuliano's adolescence, and Machiavelli, of course, also wrote these famous poems, Giuliano, when he was imprisoned in Florence on suspicion of conspiracy against the Medici. They were very, very close, and he was very closely associated. So that the reason that one of the reasons Machiavelli was rejected by the Medici, it was the fact that he was too closely associated with Giuliano, and Leo X wanted to keep Giuliano out of Florence, and he wanted him to found a state in the Romagna. The other reason for Machiavelli's failure to take up Medici patronage is that Machiavelli had this famous correspondence with the Florentine aristocrat, and who had been a diplomatic colleague of Machiavelli, Francesco Vettori. And Machiavelli, Machiavelli, of course, after he was sacked from the chancellery at the end of 1512, he kept asking Vettori, who was a very influential courtier in Rome and Florentine ambassador there, he kept asking Vettori to help him to get a job. And eventually, in 1514, he was the Pope and the Cardinal and their cousin Cardinal Giulio de' Medici set Machiavelli a test through Vettori, and the test was: in that instance, would Machiavelli recommend the papacy to be allied with France or with Spain? And Machiavelli was very much always emphasized the pro-French approach. He was very sympathetic on the whole to France. And so he then said, by no means have Spain. The correct, best alliance for the papacy would be France. And this was the wrong answer, because Leo X, he had actually already drafted an agreement with Spain, with Ferdinand of the King of Spain, King Ferdinand, and therefore he failed the test. So he was finished.
That's so interesting, because as I'm sure we'll have other calls to talk about. I mean, he was such a sort of a patriot for Florence, and in fact, Florence then goes on to be traditionally allied very much with France. But at this particular moment, his judgment was wrong. I want to turn now to the Discourses, and I was very interested to read that, unlike the Prince, you say that Discourses had no immediate political context or purpose. So in one sense, they were an academic or quasi-academic exercise. And here we're firmly back at the kind of Ciceronian territory of history being a guide to the present as a teacher of life, a light of truth. You mentioned also that by turning to the greatest historian of the Roman Republic, Livy, Machiavelli can reveal himself as the unequivocal Republican, as you put it. However, Machiavelli being Machiavelli, he did not satisfy himself by limiting his commentary to Livy alone, but also drew on other classical writers. In this case, although in translation, the Greek historian Polybius. Could you tell us why this is significant?
Well, the first and most important reason why it's so significant is that it provides the clue to the correct dating of the Discourses. There was a great controversy for many years when the Discourses were written. In 1956, Jack Hexter put forward a really a brilliant article saying that the reason that Machiavelli drew on, with significance that Machiavelli drew on Polybius, was that the first 5 books of Polybius had been available, translated from the Greek in the 15th century, but the 6th book, which has only survived partially, was not then available. Now, the Hexter said that the person who translated he made the hypothesis that Machiavelli was using the translation of the 6th book of Polybius by Janus Lascaris, the Greek scholar. And this And this would have meant, well, Hexter said that this then therefore meant that the discourses were subsequent to 1515, when Machiavelli was introduced to Lascaris in the Rucellai Gardens, or Gardens, the famous discussion in the Rucellai, sponsored by the Rucellai family. But the Italians then opposed Hexter and say, oh, this is not true, because there are loads of, or a number of possible other translations of Polybius VI that exist. And this was really left. And so the Italians, a lot of them said that what actually happened was that Machiavelli, while he was chancellor, started on the Discourses. He was then stimulated by various points he reached in the Discourses to write the Prince, and then he went back to the Discourses. However, this whole controversy has now been solved very absolutely, with absolute certainty, by the research of John Monfesani, because nobody, although the Hexter didn't ever look at the manuscripts of Janus Lascaris, nor did any of the Italians. Nobody ever looked at the actual manuscripts of the translations of Janus Lascaris. And Monfesani published an article in 2016, which actually showed that Machiavelli was absolute word for word, translating from Italian, from Latin into Italian, in that of Lascaris' translation. There was absolutely no doubt that Machiavelli used the translation of Janus Lascaris, which has completely, can I say, rubbished the whole Italian thesis. Because the fact of the matter is, Machiavelli could never have had access to this translation, because the copy that it existed in Florence was in the possession of the Rucellai family, and particularly of Bernardo Rucellai, the original convener of the Rucellai Gardens. And there's no way that Machiavelli could have possibly had any contact with Bernardo Rucellai, because Bernardo Rucellai was the absolute the most extreme enemy of Machiavelli's former boss, Piero Soderini. And Machiavelli could never have had any contact with Bernardo. Bernardo Rucellai actually went into exile out of hatred for what Piero Soderini was doing. So the only way that Machiavelli could ever have access to this unpublished manuscript translation of Lascaris was through the Rucellai Gardens, because Bernardo Rucellai died in October 1514. And then the Rucellai Gardens discussions were reconvened in 1515 by his grandson, Cosimo Rucellai. And it's there that Machiavelli got access to the translation of Polybius in Polybius, by Janus Lascaris.
Thank you very much, Bob.
The other thing that I'd like to say about Polybius is that it gave Machiavelli this idea, the cyclical idea of history. The history goes around in circles from various regimes to their degenerate regimes. Machiavelli was very interested in. The other reason for Polybius is important is that Polybius represented for Machiavelli, who is now turning to humanism again, and particularly Polybius VI was one of these obscure authors, which the humanists always liked to by which the humanists like to demonstrate their erudition. And so Polybius was Machiavelli's indication that he was a follower of, he was a humanist erudite. And this is true also. Other people have actually tried to say that other authors, rare authors, were adopted by Machiavelli in the using Discourses. For example, Dionysius of Halicarnassus or Lucretius. But in fact, these theses are exaggerated, because there's almost no direct philological or provable parallel in the Discourses between very little between Dionysius and Halicarnassus. In other words, there's some general, but actual there's no general resemblance don't mean anything. You have to have word for word resemblances. Otherwise, these things are true. And similarly, Lucretius, this has been exaggerated as well.
Thank you very much. Another close reader of, particularly interesting reader of the Discorsi was Francesco Guicciardini, very much a fellow Florentine, very different, from a different background, aristocrat. And Guicciardini wrote his famous Considerations of the Discorsi, and he takes Machiavelli to task for what he calls the perverse confidence of Machiavelli in the judgment of the lower orders. But he also attacks Machiavelli for the latter's abuse of historical evidence, because for Guicciardini, the institutions and practices of the Roman Republic, which, as you know, Machiavelli uses to shed light on the present, they say do not, or rather as a model, to be used as a model for the present, do not constitute, according to Guicciardini, the ideal exemplar for modern political behavior. Guicciardini repeatedly indicates the defects of Roman government and argues that it was only the Roman army that averted this disaster. And Guicciardini finally shows that Machiavelli's juxtaposition of Roman virtus, of virtue, and contemporary corruption is just false, as it depends on a misreading of the evidence. And I was wondering whether you think what you think of this criticism made of Guicciardini of Machiavelli.
Well, first of all, one has to realize that Guicciardini and Machiavelli became very, very close friends, beginning in 1521, or perhaps just before. And Guicciardini became Machiavelli's absolute closest friend and sponsor and everything from about end of 1520 until his death in 1527. And the result of this is that the Discourses, which was a very controversial work, because it denigrated Christianity, it was a very radical, it was very anti-Medici, explicitly so, and it was a work that Machiavelli never imagined could possibly ever be circulated. So Guicciardini is the only person who is known actually to have a copy or to have read Machiavelli's Discourses. And his first evidence of this is in his Guicciardini's dialogue on the government of Florence, 1524. So what's interesting about it is in their correspondence, of course, Guicciardini and Machiavelli had quite a lengthy correspondence beginning in 1521 until Machiavelli's death in 1527. But in their correspondence, Machiavelli puts forward all the ideas, and Guicciardini says nothing, has virtually no comment of any subject. All the ideas come from Machiavelli, and Guicciardini talks about personal affairs and things like this, but he doesn't talk about his own reaction. So that his reaction to Machiavelli only explicitly occurs when he writes these considerations on the Discourse, which also weren't, Guicciardini did not intend ever to publish these. They were like everything else Guicciardini wrote. They were private works, which he never published in his lifetime. Anyway, but the thing about Guicciardini and Machiavelli is that Machiavelli, they had totally different approaches to history, because Guicciardini moved more and more toward a much more rigorous, factual-based history. And that's very much comes out in the considerations and discourses of Machiavelli, whereas Machiavelli didn't practice this type of history at all. For Machiavelli, history was the teacher of the teacher. And so it was the lessons of the ancients, and particularly in the Romans, which were informed history. Now, the point is about Machiavelli. Machiavelli, he gave his own, he didn't actually cite or didn't use the ancients in their own way. He used it in his own way. He took these little bits from Livy or from wherever and developed him according to his own ideas and presuppositions. And so they had a totally different approach to history. So it's not a question of which one is right, because I mean, Machiavelli was the great interpreter of history, whereas Guicciardini was the one who said the limitations of history's lessons. Because for Guicciardini, each epoch and each period, each situation was unique, and it therefore couldn't apply to the present. Whereas Machiavelli said quite the opposite, but it was always Machiavelli's own reading of it, of the ancients. Wasn't what the ancients said, because Machiavelli read them and used them to put forward his own ideas.
That's fascinating. And really, I suppose we've got to remember here that we're dealing with a manuscript culture, even though it's almost a century after the invention of print. Bisogni, as we'll see in a moment, the only work that makes it into print during Machiavelli's lifetime is his treatise on the art of war. But here in front of us now, we've got two images of two works that remind us that Machiavelli was not just a political author, he was also a dramatist. On the right, we've got his comedy, The Mandragola. And more recently still, we have the recently discovered letter about the plague, very unfortunately, very topical. Perhaps we should deal first, though, with Machiavelli the dramatist, because you actually mentioned at one point and say it's one of the most brilliant Italian dramatic comedies ever written. Really, why should we pay any attention to it, besides the fact it's by the most famous Italian political philosopher?
Well, we have paid attention to it because Italian literary critics many of them have argued that the Mandragola was the greatest comedy drama of the Italian Renaissance, and some of them have even said it's the greatest drama or comedy ever written in the Italian language. And you can there's certainly justification for that, because in the first place, it is the most hilarious and completely side-splitting read. When you not read it in English or anything, but read it in Italian, and it absolutely is just riveting and so incredibly funny. But it's also an indication, the Mandragola, of Machiavelli's humanism, because Machiavelli in the Mandragola writes a perfect example of what's called a commedia erudita, an erudite comedy, which is a comedy that goes back and tries to put forward all the principles and practices of the ancient Latin comic writers, mainly Terence, but also to some extent Plautus. And so it's a perfect example of Machiavelli's renewed humanism, and it is inconceivable that this work could have been written outside of his contact with the Rucellai Gardens. And so it is a very interesting comedy from that point of view, but it also brings to light a dramatic and fictional version of what Machiavelli's political thought is, because the world of Mandragola is the very black world in a domestic setting of the prince. It is the most incredibly amoral and negative comedy you can imagine. Negative human nature, immorality, amorality, irreligion, anti-Christianism, anti-clericalism. It's a caricature of Machiavelli's political world, and where there's no there's no ideals, there's no virtue. It's dominated by primordial instincts, luxury, avarice, pride, procreation. And what's very important about the Mandragola is that in his other writings of the period, or near then, there was always some hope. The prince, there was hope for the a Medicean or a prince to throw the barbarians out of Italy. And the same thing is true of the Discourses or the As, Machiavelli's As. They always had some hope. But in Mandragora is the real bottom. There is absolutely no hope. There's nothing for the rest of the world except hopeless evil. It is the most negative. It is the most negative imaginable thing, but it is incredibly funny and incredibly riveting piece of work. Not, as I say, no, I've never seen a good production of it, but when you read it, it is an amazing.
It gives a new meaning to black humor, but I think
more black than you'll ever imagine.
We'll press on. We'll perhaps come back to the letter about the plague in the questions, but we now turn to what I think is perhaps the most controversial part of your biography, in which, as Jim Hankins, the great American scholar, has noted, you are the first scholar to make the strong case for the fact that Machiavelli evolved into a political conservative. But perhaps first we need to discuss, at least briefly, Machiavelli's Art of War, in which, according to your new and fresh arc of interpretation, marks the start of this transition. And before you continue, I think it's worth emphasizing your own point that this treatise on war, we're entering a new territory, as not only the Prince and Discourses, but also the Mandragora first circulated in manuscript, whereas the Art of War was written for the press.
That's right, and so the Art of War is a treatise about military organization, and it rejects. It is inspired by the Roman model, ancient Roman model, and rejects the use of mercenaries. That was the common practice and predominant practice in Italy in Machiavelli's lifetime. But it also marks a kind of transition in Machiavelli between his very ardent anti-Medicianism, hostility to the Medici and to monarchical rule in the Discourses, which of course weren't widely known. Only Guicciardini would have known about this, and not even then when the Art of War was published. But it is a kind of point at which he's teetering, because on the one hand, the principal interlocutor of the Art of War is the mercenary captain Fabrizio Colonna. Now, the Colonna family were absolute enemies of the Orsini family, Roman family, but therefore it was. But the Medici family was very closely linked by marriage and all sorts of other ties with the Orsini. So the using of Fabrizio Colonna is a very much an anti-Medician gesture. However, on the other hand, the dedicatee of the Art of War was Lorenzo Strozzi, who was a close, very power-element Medician, very close collaborator with the Medici and was a great friend and advisor of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino. And so he was sort of going a bit between the two things. But the real thing that's most interesting about the Art of War is that unlike the Prince and the Discourses and the actual traditional morality and traditional are very much emphasized in the Art of War. I mean, in the Art of War, Machiavelli defends the common good, law, justice, peace, keeping in one's word, fear of God, prayers for divine aid and patriotism. These are all things that were absolutely rejected in the Prince and the Discourses. And so he's now turning back to much more conservative and conventional values in the art.
Thank you. And this is a process that really reaches its conclusion in the work that's been shown here on the slide, which is the 1532 edition of the Storia Fiorentina, the History of Florence, published 5 years after Machiavelli's death. And this is, if I'm correct, is the only work for which the author was actually paid and for which he had a contract. With this commission, as you put it yourself, Machiavelli's rehabilitation was complete at last. Could you just, to wrap up things, can you explain glosses briefly?
Well, I mean, the important thing here is that the history of Florence has many bridges to both the Prince and the Discourses of Machiavelli's other works, but it's also very different in many ways, because it, unlike the Prince and the Discourses, is a work written explicitly to encourage the Medici, and particularly Pope Clement VII, as a reformer of Florence. And he wants there to portray he wants Florence to become a republic of virtue in the traditional sense. And therefore, the history of Florence is very much departs from the world and the texts of the Prince and the Discourses, because here Machiavelli he rejects the 15th century Medici as tyrants. He rejects tyranny and absolute power. He endorses the public good, which was rejected in the Prince. Discourses had argued for discord, but here everything is based on concord between people and allies. The rule in the Prince, he said, Machiavelli says it was better for a ruler to be feared than loved. In the history of Florentine histories, he gives exactly the opposite. He's reconciled. Machiavelli in the Prince, and particularly in the Discourses, was a very pro-popular, anti-aristocratic, but now he reconciles himself with the traditional nobility, and feudal nobility, which have been rejected in the Discourses. The Prince and the Discourses were very critical of Venice and the aristocratic constitution and methods of Venice, but here he praises Venice in the history of Florence, and most importantly, he becomes an advocate of the mixed constitution, which had been something that was praised by the Florentines, was always held up and the model for that was Venice, and it really was a cover for an actual aristocratic republic. And so the history of Florence really becomes an endorsement and a program for the achievement of an aristocratic government and regime in Florence. And,
thank you.
And it goes in his, and he therefore, Machiavelli at the end of his life moves very closely to the actual political point of view of his greatest friend at the time, Francesco Guicciardini.
Thank you. That seems a very, obviously we could stay here very much longer, and I wish we could at the time, but I want to free up some time now for questions. But I'd like to just end with there's a sort of a contrast there between the young Machiavelli and the middle-aged Machiavelli and the Machiavelli of his later years, but also the ultimate irony, if we look at the last slide, that here is a man who is notorious for his hostility to the last one, François, the other direction, yeah, which is of course the tomb in the Franciscan church of Santa Croce in Venice. There he is in a Christian church, although to be truthful, it's a kind of pantheon, literally, of great worthies like Michelangelo and Galileo are also buried there.
It's in Florence, not in Venice.
Sorry, did I say Venice? I'm sorry. I meant Florence, of course. And so, well, should we now hand over to François, who's going to chair
Yes.
the questions?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, both. So, indeed, it's time to open this for questions to the audience. It's just a matter of you using the reaction button, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and use the raise hand function. And while you're doing that, well, I have a question for you, Bob. I think from reading Machiavelli and his very dark vision of human, it's quite predictable, as he does in the Hours, that he argues for the superiority of animals over humans. What I notice is that he's not the only one to do so in the Renaissance. There's Alberti before him, and after there is Giambattista Gelli. In France, there is Montaigne and Palissy. So I wonder if it doesn't represent a kind of anti-Platonic Renaissance. If you connect this to the arts, people tend to see Platonism in terms of mannerism. This kind of analysis, to me, it brings towards naturalism and even the birth of caricature. And I would very much like to hear your comments on this matter.
Well, I think that this idea of whether it's the superiority of men or animals is a humanist, what they paragone, or a point of discussion, debate. The humanists liked very much these comparisons between on one side or the other. I mean, for example, they have one, as you say, the humanins or animals. Another favorite paragone was the republics versus monarchies, mercenaries versus native troops, people versus nobility, rulers loved or feared, and so on. So it really was a kind of literary, device here. And I don't doubt that many people thought one thing or another and actually believed this, but it was, in my view, it was a typical humanist paragone or comparison.
Okay, thank you. We've got quite a few questions in the chat. So first question from Laura Blum. Could Professor Black speak about the interest of Giovanni Gaddi in having Machiavelli's works published and the relationship between the two men?
This is, as far as I know, this something that is occurred after Machiavelli's death. Gaddi was was influential in getting the printing of either, I can't remember which, the Discourses of the Prince in 1531 or 1532. And but as far as I don't think there's any, I don't recognize Gaddi as one of Machiavelli's correspondents or a person he ever mentioned as a person with whom he's in contact with or knew about in his life. Gaddi certainly took up Machiavelli's some of Machiavelli, one or two of Machiavelli's texts, the Prince of the Discourses, I don't remember which one, and put this and sponsored his their printing in 1530, either in Rome or in Florence.
Okay, thank you. Another question from a lady called Alison. How significant was the fact that Machiavelli came from an illegitimate lineage? Would his career have been very different had he been from a legitimate one?
Well, absolutely. There's no question about that, because the Machiavelli family was an aristocratic family, and very important family in Florence, not absolutely of the first rank, but certainly of the second rank of the Florentine oligarchy. And had Machiavelli been like his various cousins, normal, not from an illegitimate line, he would certainly, like his cousins, almost certainly have participated in Florentine government and been an actual proper Florentine citizen. Because you have to understand that in Florence, and there's documentary and proof of this, and textual proof, in Florence, you were not considered a proper Florentine citizen or a citizen at all unless you were a member of a guild and you were an office holder, therefore. And since neither Machiavelli nor his father qualified in this sense, he was really put as an outsider. And that's one of the things that he was able to do. That's one of the reasons why he was able to work when he was elected to the Chancery, because the Chancery was staffed by people who weren't always or many times Florentine citizens. They were the Chancery was filled with foreigners, For example, originally, most famous example is Coluccio Solitario in the 14th century, or Machiavelli's colleague in the Chancery, Francesco Ottaviani. And he was an Aretine and only got Florentine citizenship in 1514. But he was already a very high Chancery official. So the Chancery fit Machiavelli because it wasn't for Florentine citizens.
Interesting.
Okay. Thank you. And finally, a question from Somnath Basu. Question for you, Bob. This may be a very simplistic question, said the author, but what is your opinion about Machiavelli's understanding of practical military matters?
Well, Machiavelli, a lot of the art of war, this treatise that was printed and published in 1521, is about a lot of the art of war is really about this issue about mercenaries versus native troops and how you actually organize troops. But as far as practical, or technical, we could say technological interests, Machiavelli is actually quite significant here, because Machiavelli actually was the first person, or may have been the first person, to actually recommend the use of firearms, the arquebus, in military matters, and he actually talked in favor of training in this. Machiavelli also did not think that that our artillery was useful in siege warfare. We denigrated this, but it was very useful. It could be useful. I think I got this right. It could be useful in on the field and more. So he was quite interested in the technical aspects of war, and of course he worked as a military organizer. He was appointed to be Actually, it was his idea to start the Florentine native militia, which is actually not Florentine citizens, but Florentine country people and peasants to do this. And he then, so he was very interested in the actual organization and recruitment of soldiers and how they would be trained and act. What he wasn't, there's a very amusing anecdote, which actually to round this off, how good was Machiavelli as a direct military organizer. And there's an anecdote that's provided that Machiavelli was asked to organize and to get these troops ready and drilled while he was in the field and working in the 1520s, and Machiavelli struggled for 2 or 3 hours, and he couldn't get anywhere with actually getting these people to drill correctly. And so the Medici captain at the time, Giovanni delle Bandinere, he said, "Oh, I'm really fed up with this. Step aside, Machiavelli." And he then, as a professional, he got them all ready and drilled properly so that they could all go to lunch. It was a very hot day. And so this famous anecdote, which very likely could be true.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I don't see any other questions, so perhaps on this note, it might be time, well, to thank you both, Simon and Bob, for your time and the quality time, and the audience, and say that we'll meet again at the beginning of December, speaking of your journey. But in the meantime, a very good evening to you all, and thank you for being with us. So good night and thanks again.
Thank you, François, and thank you, Bob, again.